Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I want to thank Richard Brady from Matrix Consulting, Brian Clark, our Chief Policy Advisor, Interim Chief Quinlan, and the Division of Police, Director Pettis, and Public Safety Department for all their work in getting us to where we are today. The nation and our community are at a crucial moment in policing. Community police relations are strained in some areas. Just 5 years ago, Ferguson, Missouri broke out in riots over a police-involved shooting. Other cities are still reeling from similar incidents in Charlotte, Baltimore, New York, and the list goes on. But at the same time, it's never been more dangerous to be a police officer. Just last week, 6 police officers were shot in Philadelphia. Columbus is not immune. Overall, we are a safe community. Homicides and other violent crimes are tracking downward from their peak in 2017. But we know that community police relations continue to be a place we all desire to see improvement. We hear this from the community and from our officers. As part of the comprehensive neighborhood safety strategy formed almost 2 years ago, I appointed 17 residents to form the Columbus Community Safety Advisory Commission. Their work is to review Columbus Division of Police policies, training, procedures, make recommendations for proven safety strategies to meet our residents' expectations, and protect and serve our entire community. As another tool, we hired an independent third-party consulting firm to conduct an operational review of the Columbus Division of Police through the lens of 21st century policing. Matrix Consulting has worked with our officers, community members, and city staff over the last year to develop the report that we're making available to you all today. In a moment, Richard Brady from Matrix will talk a bit more in depth about how they conducted their study and some of their recommendations. But I want to go through several key findings in the report. This independent research shows that there are areas where our Division of Police excels. CPD ranks high in community specialists, including community liaison officers, diversity and inclusion officers, and bike patrols. The division also represents best practices in many sectors of modern policing, such as policies and training. But there are also some areas where we must improve. Perceptions about police in our community differ greatly by race. Overall, 74% of respondents to a survey were positive about police services. 80% of white residents were positive, but only 61% of African American residents were positive. Matrix found similar results from employees of the Division of Police. 80% of all employees were positive about police community relations. 61% of our Black employees were positive. Perceptions of bias and discrimination vary greatly within the division as well. 51% of Black employees have seen or experienced discrimination. Gender bias appears to be an issue too, with 37% of all division employees witnessing gender or sexual orientation discrimination. This difference in experience, from discrimination to use of force, threatens the legitimacy of our public safety work and the safety of our families and first responders. It runs counter to our shared values of diversity, inclusiveness, and opportunity for all. Our work in this city, especially public safety, must be grounded in these values. So I've instructed Director Pettis to make implementation of Matrix recommendations in this area a top priority. Director Pettis has already been answering the call to expand the number of minorities in police and fire, and we're seeing results. We have seen a steady increase in our minority police recruit classes since 2016. We also recently hired an equal opportunity director in public safety to handle complaints of safety personnel. But there's more work to do within our division and with the community. The operational review found some supervision inefficiencies. While the work found strong policies in the division, there was a lack of consistency in their implementation. We will explore matrix recommendations to provide more effective and immediate supervision to patrol officers. We will also work to explore the matrix recommendations for improving deployment of our officers so that appropriate number of officers are on duty in the right place at the right time. This may include reducing or eliminating the number of two-person patrol units, making sure sergeants are able to respond to the scenes, and civilianizing some jobs currently held by uniform officers. This would get more officers on the streets and able to cover more areas. Finally, something that I have talked about repeatedly and something that I think is more important now than ever, the importance of officer wellness. Here's a staggering truth. More police officers die by their own hand than by criminals. 6 Chicago police officers died by suicide in an 8-month period from 2018 to 2019. New York City has seen 9 officer suicides this year. There's no question that the job of being a police officer is one of the most stressful, and we must provide the tools for officer wellness. Matrix found significant room for enhancing officer well-being, including expanding the definition of trauma and continuing to instill a stronger cultural understanding around the need for psychological care. There's a lot to digest in this report, and I'd like to emphasize one additional point. The recommendations work together to improve the division as a whole. Better supervision, improved deployment, enhanced officer wellness will all help with the disparity we see from the community and from within the division. Now I'd like to invite Richard Brady from Matrix to come forward and tell you a little bit more about how this report was created. Richard.
So, good afternoon. I am Richard Brady. I'm the president of Matrix Consulting Group, and I was the project manager on this assignment. I've brought Devon Clunas, who was former chief of Winnipeg, Canada, who has been a member of our firm for a few years and is starting our new Canadian practice as well. He was one of the 6-person team that worked with the Division of Police on this long journey that started at the end of last year. It was a very in-depth study that we conducted for you, as 335 pages I think would demonstrate, but it is very fact-based, as you can see by looking through the report, that whether we're looking at calls for service or we're looking at investigative cases or reports generated for administrative functions, that we look extensively at that. And we worked extensively with the employees within the police division, interviewed over 200 of them. We had an employee survey that almost 1,100 people responded to. But it wasn't just inwardly focused. We had input from the community as well. We had a survey, a telephone survey, which reached almost 700 people within the community throughout the city. We had 10 focus group meetings in different communities within Columbus to get views about police services and to provide us with a glimpse of what they thought were issues within police services, because that's an important part of what we were asked to do. I mean, we've been asked to look at police staffing issues for up to 40 years in my experience in large police departments and small police departments in Ohio and across the country. Today, more is expected of law enforcement. And so it's not just looking at, do we have the right number of people deployed to respond to calls for service? A more holistic policing is expected, in which the community is supported, the community has partnerships with police, the people who are being protected can help shape what that protection is. And that affects law enforcement in a lot of ways. It means that when you're looking at staffing, you're also looking at policy development and how important that is for what officers are doing in their day-to-day jobs. It's looking at how they're trained to get that kind of support so that they've got the background and training and education and experience to do their jobs effectively. It's looking at how they're mentored by first-line supervisors, how they're led by managers within law enforcement. It's looking at all sorts of practices about personnel issues, how they're engaged with the community. All of these things come together to represent effective policing in America today. Increasingly, these things for enlightened communities, of which I think Columbus is one, are wrapped up in a series of concepts that were initiated in President Obama's administration, a commission that he had on 21st century policing, which the mayor mentioned. And it is now the gold standard for what effective law enforcement is. It's not so much a checklist, it's not so much a report card on law enforcement, it's a series of principles that law enforcement is supposed to implement in order to effectively represent and be in partnerships with the community, given the unique nature of each community, because Columbus is different from any other million-person city that you're going to see out there. And law enforcement and the partnerships that are developed with the community are going to be unique because of that. Overall, the Columbus Division of Police is organized and has developed policies, recruitment strategies, training consistent with with 21st century policing practices. And that's important to state. As you go through a 330-page report, you're going to see 140 recommendations with the division under a microscope. But overall, they are consistent with those principles. There are some gaps, there are some things that they need to focus on, and that's what we did in the last 9 months of this study process. Overall, the issues relate to a disconnect that occurs between the theory of effective policies, about effective training, about first-line supervision and management, and the practice in the field. And most of these 140 recommendations relate to how more effectively do that. They fall in 4 areas. One is to work better with the community in terms of defining what that relationship should be. Work with the community in different community settings to define what that partnership would be, how they should help to identify problems and deploy personnel and types of services to address the specific problems that happen in different parts of the city of Columbus. That should be a facilitated process with somebody who knows the community, who can be that bridge between the community and the police division in order to shorten the distance that bridge has to cover. And we've got a number of recommendations in that area. There are other recommendations to more completely implement the principles of 21st century policing. There are some gaps in policy relating to being more consistent in the way you approach use of force, de-escalation techniques, etc., which are evolutionarily tweaking the progress that the police division has already made in those areas. Training so that we aren't just focusing in the police division on the techniques of being an effective police officer, but also the relationships. So that there are recommendations about training as it relates to talking to the public, being more proactive, those kinds of things, as well as the things that they're required to do within law enforcement. One of the most important set of recommendations that we have relate to first-line supervision, especially in patrol. I have said, and with all due respects to the chief, that sergeants in police departments are the most important position there is, because they are the ones who are the spokespersons for the department. They're there, and when important events happen, they're there to make sure that that the policies, that the training is in place and is being exercised by officers in the field doing their jobs and interacting with the community. And there aren't enough of them in patrol. The spans of control are much wider than they should be in order for patrol sergeants to be in contact with police officers every day in every part of the city. And you need something like 17 of them to have more effective levels of supervision within patrol. So these recommendations are all linked, as the mayor mentioned. So you can go the extra mile and create the more effective policies, make changes to the training program, but if you don't have sergeants out there being the eyes and ears between the community and the management of the police division, there are going to be problems implementing it completely. So in terms of making it happen, having that complete implementation, it's one of the most important set of recommendations that we've made within this report. Lastly, there are going to be issues with the police division being more proactive because they don't have enough time to do it. They are spending most of their time literally going from call to call to call. During the daytime, from about 10 o'clock in the morning until between about 6 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night, depending on the day, they have less than 20% of their time to be proactive, when the standards in law enforcement are to be effective in community engagement, community policing, and problem-solving techniques. You need something like 35 and 40%. Overall, they're at 32%. That doesn't sound so bad. That's pretty close. But most of it happens after about midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning, when there's only so many proactive things that you can do. You can't redeploy your way out of this issue because the city is pretty equally covered within patrol. There are some operational practices that they've implemented. About an eighth of their units, about 13% of their units are two-person units. When if it's for this city, it would not be inappropriate to have single-person units. That also affects response times because they've doubled up the proportion of times that they have. But that's not going to fix it. So you need something in the order of, depending on some of the choices you have about deployment, between 55 and 76 people to be added to the police force to get you to that 35 to 40% range. Because 35%, again, isn't going to quite bridge that gap during the daytime hours. You need to be closer to 40% to adjust for that problem of nighttime when you can't really use the proactive time, and the daytime when you really need it. So again, those four areas are really about working better with the community, about more completely implementing 21st century policing, having the first line supervision to provide effective oversight of police community relations and police services, and lastly, ensuring that people in patrol have enough time to be as proactive and problem solving as you want them to be. So that is our report. So I'm going to turn it over now to the Commission Chair, Janet Jackson, who's going to provide her perspective on this process as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you to Richard Brady and the Matrix team for your thorough study and survey. In March of 2018, Mayor Ginther appointed me chair of the Columbus Community Safety Advisory Commission. Our charge, and many of the commissioners are here with us today, was to make concrete, actionable recommendations to further strengthen our division of police to ensure that safety strategies meet our residents' expectations and protect and serve our entire community. We have spent the last year reviewing existing research of respected law enforcement and social justice experts. We have spent countless hours covering subjects including use of force, hiring process and collective bargaining, internal affairs, crisis intervention training, 21st century policing. We also held a community forum in June to listen to what our residents have to say. At the same time, Matrix Consulting has been conducting a safety evaluation that covers work outside of the scope of the Commission. I am happy, the Commissioners are happy, to receive this report today that gives concrete and impartial data to the operations of our Division of Police. You've all heard the highlights of the report. There is a disparity in the way people of color, both residents and sworn officers, experience policing. There are some inefficiencies in the way that police officers are employed and how they are supervised. There are concerns about how officers are assigned and promoted based on seniority above merit. And officer wellness must be given additional attention. It is now my job as the chair of the Safety Commission to incorporate this data into the recommendations we make to Mayor Ginther. In the coming weeks, the Commission will form our recommendations. We will also have another community forum to gain more feedback on our recommendations. Again, I am grateful to the Mayor, to Matrix, and to each of the Commissioners, and to the Division of Police for all of the work that's been put into this process. I look forward to our next steps and ultimately to the implementation of plans that will make Columbus a leader in public safety and community relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you again, Richard, and to the entire team. Too often, what happens with a report is that it is read, and it's simply left on a shelf. That will not happen here. I want to reiterate our next steps and share our plans towards implementation. As Chair Jackson said, the Community Safety Advisory Commission will use the findings of this report to inform their recommendations. And many things recommended in the report are already part of Interim Chief Quinlan's reorganization. I commend you, Chief, for being forward-thinking and solution-oriented. The next few weeks, I will form an implementation committee to review and take on the task of carrying out the recommendations in the report and the recommendations of the Safety Commission. Again, thanks to all of you for coming out this afternoon. I would like to recognize all the Safety Commission members that are here. Would you just raise your hand so that everybody here knows who's part of the Safety Advisory Commission? Thank you for your service and all your work up to this point. We look forward to your final recommendations. Have a good afternoon.